Mostly the only one declaring wars. Once you're in them, the AI will attack undefended cities of yours the moment it senses one.
I remember it like it was yesterday. The day I came back from school, booted up my brother's desktop and saw the notification for this video. I didn't follow gaming news much, if at all, back then, and that hasn't really changed, to be fair, which left me to find out about Rome 2's existence on the day of its release. Some background is necessary. I came to the series with Empire, and by the time Rome 2 dropped I already had a few hundred hours in Shogun 2, and was aware of the sentiment that it was a contender for the best title in the franchise yet. And I, like many others, was shocked to see how Rome 2 shaped up. While today, I'm running a primarily Total War YouTube channel and have made multiple analysis videos at this point covering topics ranging from unit balancing to campaign progression to interfacing. Back in 2013, I didn't have much grasp of what made a good video game. So, at the time, I saw Rome 2's issues as being those of poor optimization, a rushed release just like Empire, and that which is the norm for many game launches these days. And with the modern wonder that is YouTube, you can go right back to that era and see that anger was primarily focused on bugs, optimization, and scummy DLC practices. It wasn't until Reynolds Sanity dropped his in-depth Rome 2 critique that I could finally look past the game's bug-ridden exterior to see the much graver design issues plaguing the experience. I had already played a few campaigns by the time I watched this video, where I felt annoyed at not being able to move units independently on the campaign map, but thanks to his wonderful video, I could now put into words nearly everything wrong with the game. My goal with this retrospective is to see how well the game has aged, though I should reiterate my belief that a game that released in a terrible state should always be remembered for it, no matter how much it has been improved since then. So, does Rome 2 is AM worth it in 2077? I know that a large chunk of the game's fans will concede that while the battles aren't as good as Shogun 2, this game's direct predecessor, Rome 2's real selling point is the much improved campaign, typically citing the expanded diplomacy options and revamped army system. I don't agree with the sentiment that the campaign is the main focus, for a few reasons. The first being that the Carthage trailer, the most famous and infamous part of the game's promotional material, was centered on the game's real-time battles. The second, that Total War made a name for itself on the promise of its real-time battles, and the supposed shift away to focusing on the campaign layer mechanics would still be a betrayal towards the people who had rightfully expected the series to continue along the trajectory of primarily focusing on the real-time battles. And the third, being that the campaign itself has seen major regressions, but that's something I will get into in another chapter. But anyway, the battles. Morale is a mere suggestion now, to the point that battles feel more like a poorly done caricature of the battles from previous titles. Flanking and rear charges have such negligible effect on morale that it renders engagements more a question of unit quality than using your units effectively in conjunction with one another and the terrain. This is, of course, not to imply that unit quality was a non-factor in previous titles. For those of you who may be new to the channel, I'm going to contrast Rome 2 with Shogun 2 quite a bit, both because Shogun 2 is the game's direct predecessor and my most played Total War game. Now, in a game like Shogun 2, units within the same class are most obviously differentiated in terms of morale. While a unit of fresh Yari Ashigaru will invariably crumble if swamped by multiple cavalry units, a unit of Yari Samurai will be a much tougher nut to crack. However, the classes themselves are also strongly balanced against each other. That same unit of Yari Samurai is going to be shredded if faced with a unit of Lone Sword Ashigaru. the cheapest unit of sword infantry. Rome 2 features pike infantry, spear infantry, melee and missile cavalry, and so on. But it handles these with the grace of an uninspired employee looking to tick a bunch of boxes on the unit classes featured in RTSs, without much thought to how they interact with one another. And I can say that with confidence after conducting more than a dozen unit tests. I tested the lightest and heaviest spears against both light and heavy cavalry, guided by their passive bonus versus large, only to watch them be outright defeated at worst or trade horribly at best. I then substituted them for Egyptian pikemen and watched them annihilate the royal cataphracts, though in my opinion it still takes way too long for the fight to be resolved. If you don't know much about this game's balancing but have an idea of what sensible balancing looks like, you might think that the pikemen are adept at handling cavalry at the cost of being more susceptible to heavy infantry. I knew the reality of this game's balancing already, but I ran the test for the sake of not having to take my word for anything. I squared the mid-tier pikemen against veteran legionaries, who lost quite decisively despite being significantly more expensive than the pikes. Only the very best melee infantry, we are talking Praetorian Guard level, can best pikemen, and even then at considerable cost to themselves. Now it all comes together. Pikemen are by far the most cost-effective units, handily beating two major unit classes while lacking a direct counter of their own. I suppose the idea was that pikemen are unbeatable from the front, while being vulnerable on the flanks and slow to move their formation around to meet a flanking opponent. But the AI seems completely unaware of this possibility, even on the highest difficulty. And that's going to be my response to the inevitable counter-argument that this is just no different to Shogun 2's Yari Ashigaru spam. A fresh unit of Yari Ashigaru is not going to beat a unit of Katana Samurai in a straight fight. It's direct counter. Since Rome 2's pikemen derive a lot of their value from the pike wall formation, this is a good time to address the implementation of formations. Formations, such as Diamond Formation and Pike Wall, have been reduced to passive stat modifiers. Whereas Shogun 2's Wedge Formation conferred no stat bonuses or debuffs to cavalry, instead the shape of the formation itself allows you to better exploit gaps in a formation and break units in half, allowing your cavalry to pull through with fewer casualties. And whereas Yari Wall allowed the Ashigaru to outrange every other melee unit such that they can attack without exposing themselves, in Rome 2, these formations have been relegated to bonuses that have no relation whatsoever to the actual shape of the unit itself. Yari Wall isn't a magic button. The men won't get much protection if they haven't formed up before taking a charge. The unit has to be handled with a bare minimum level of care to exploit this advantage. But Rome 2's version pays no attention to this detail. Even if the formation is visually under strain, the same buffs apply. If you ever heard someone criticize Total War for having become arcadey, this is almost certainly what they're referring to. Yari Ashigaru needed a bit of effort to realize their potential. That meant using the terrain to your advantage, placing them on a hill, ideally one with some tree cover to shelter them from arrow fire. You weren't going to get very far just mashing the Yari Wall button while throwing them at an enemy force. The height advantage in Rome 2 is negligible, and coupled with the AI's propensity for massing its forces into a blob along your front line, renders battles a complete formality. You either have the better army composition or you lose the fight. A fancy card trading game. That's a lot of negatives, and this isn't just me actively looking for anything wrong with this game. It really is that bad, and the one thing it has going for it is the improved line of sight feature. This adds a fog of war to the battle map, where the terrain dynamically affects the visibility of a unit. An army marching behind a hill will not be visible to the enemy, instead of hiding being restricted to forested terrain, as it had been previously. I can tell you, this mechanic had awesome potential based on two things. It finally answers the issue of archers and other non-gunpowder infantry being able to fire at targets they should not be able to see. And secondly, Fall of the Samurai's gunpowder warfare was made so engaging by being able to utilize even the smallest of terrain imperfections, to shield a unit from enemy fire. It's a great feature stranded in an otherwise terrible game. The campaign has seen two major changes, either of them meriting its own chapter. Prior to Rome 2, each and every military and naval unit you recruited could be moved independently on the map, providing with a potentially large amount of approaches to your expansion and territorial defense. One of the most obvious benefits of this system was the ability to selectively reinforce garrisons with a few units. This was especially true in Shogun 2 and its Fall of the Samurai expansion, where the garrisons spawned in event of an attack were overall quite weak. Some of my more memorable experiences are of late game siege defenses, where you may have an odd combination of early and late game units, say a fresh unit of Yariashigaru and a unit of matchlocks. In some cases, you could even adopt a multi-layered defensive pattern on the campaign map, the purpose of an outer settlement not to halt the enemy advance, but exact a heavy price on them for advancing a lot of the time. A favorite tactic of mine is something I like to call siege trapping. It's where I intentionally remove a main army from a settlement, supplementing the garrison with just a few units. There's more than one benefit to doing this. Firstly, it will entice the enemy army to attack the settlement right away, instead of raiding the buildings and potentially having another army join up with them. Secondly, keeping my main force out in the field ensures I have the option to retreat from a bad fight, whereas sitting in the fort could lead to scenarios where the enemy army sieges me down while a second army shows up. If I lose that fight, I lose the whole army, and that's especially bad if I have a high-ranking general leading them. Thirdly, if the AI chooses to attack the settlement, I can force some very bad trades on them. They're forced to expend their experienced soldiers to take out my cheaper, smaller garrison. You could even get lucky and get rid of the generals. Whatever damage you do here will make what comes next much easier. You can either hope they will rush to attack your field army after this with their battered units, or you could siege them down, and now they're the ones who are forced to either fight it out or get completely destroyed. This siege trap is especially useful for ensuring the death of a dangerous general. What enables this is the ability to selectively reinforce garrisons, offering significant force multipliers to a unit that would otherwise perform poorly in an open field battle. In other cases, you might spread out some units across 2 or more provinces in public order duties, only to consolidate them into one settlement, in the face of an imminent attack by an enemy force. The system allowed you the flexibility of maintaining the integrity of your empire, while leaving yourself with enough forces to engage in offensive actions. Not only does Rome 2 remove independent unit movement, it also added a cap on how many armies you can field, the cap expanding in relation to an increase in Imperium, which is itself increased through conquering settlements. While the army cap doesn't pose much of a restriction in the earlier phases of the campaign, during the late game it will limit your ability to continue expanding while guarding your other frontiers. You can preempt enemy land invasions through scouting, sure, but what you can't reasonably defend against are naval invasions. The game is also the first to allow land-based military units to traverse bodies of water without the need for a dedicated navy. Because of the game's turn-based nature on the campaign map, it is quite easy and risk-free to ferry troops across a shorter body of water, say across the Aegean Sea or the Adriatic. The only thing left that could thwart such an invasion would be stationing an army at the point of landing or the target settlement. That is, expending one of your precious army slots to do so. In one fell swoop, Rome 2 not only damages your ability to protect against naval invasions, but also renders dedicated navies a questionable investment. To be clear, Total War has always struggled with naval warfare on a strategic level. Empire had solid ship-to-ship combat, but the problem remained that winning the war at sea was generally inconsequential to the overall outcome of the war. So long as you could ferry your land units to where they were needed, the rest of your naval actions could end up feeling like a waste of your time and resources. In Shogun 2 especially, where ships are cheap and easy to replace, the sea is often clogged up with an inexhaustible supply of enemy fleets. Establishing naval dominance is a futile affair. So the most you'll often do is build one ship to transport units and immediately scupper it after it serves its function. Fall of the Samurai is the only game in the series that handled its strategic naval aspect well. By adding naval bombardments, there was a stronger link between naval power and the war on land. While the exorbitant costs of building a port and the navy placed a curb on the AI's naval spam that clogged the map in the base game. Those costs of building and upkeep also served to make the encounters decisive. Finally, in a game where land movement was slow without railroads, a late game development available only in some provinces, naval transport of armies was a welcome option to have in your arsenal. Rome 2 doesn't just take us back to Empire, it regresses even further in making the naval war strategically pointless when you can effectively spawn a navy out of thin air by moving your armies over water. The issue could have been somewhat rectified by not having an arbitrary army cap. They also made it possible for garrison units to reinforce armies outside of the settlement, which significantly shifts the advantage even further in the favor of the defender. While it makes sense that the defender should get some sort of home field advantage, such as the defensive benefits of fortifications and the attacker's inability to replenish in hostile territory, and while previous entries already arguably offered too great an advantage to defenders, Rome 2 shifts that advantage even further, oftentimes forcing you to resort to attacking with overwhelming forces, sometimes 2 armies in a game where army slots are at a premium already. To clarify, in previous games, units that you recruited and garrisoned in a settlement could reinforce nearby armies in the field, but this was not the case with the free garrison units. Those were spawned only in defense of the settlement and nothing more. It was a smart way of improving the defensiveness of a province without turning the campaign map into a World War I-esque stalemate where the cost of offense was exorbitantly high, which interestingly does materialize when using some of the Shogun 2 mods that buff garrisons. I can guess what the motivation behind both the removal of independent unit movement and the introduction of the army cap was. To make the game less tedious to play and to prevent the late game from turning into a joke of armies steamrolling across the map supported by effectively infinite funds. But this system? Firstly, I would much rather an easy game than a needlessly tedious one. A tedious game and a challenging one are not the same thing, after all, and Rome 2 is firmly in the former camp. Secondly, and contradicting the idea of providing a late game challenge, Realm Divide, one of Shogun 2's best additions, has not made a return here.
It is dangerous to be the tallest tree, for that is where the axe strikes first.
Now, I know that a common sentiment exists in the Total War internet sphere that campaigns have actually never been challenging, that there is always a point beyond the mid-game where you eclipse your rivals and can't possibly lose the game, where any defeats incurred upon you will be nothing more than a minor inconvenience, and that Rome 2 is not unique in this regard. While Rome 2 is indeed not at all unique in this regard, it is far too easy to amass funds in earlier games such as Medieval 2, and the AI in later games such as Warhammer will at some point be surpassed heavily in military and economic terms. There have been not one, but at least 2 installments in the series that did more or less succeed in providing a welcome challenge throughout. Shogun 2 and its expansion Fall of the Samurai. And Realm Divide, though an important factor, is not the only reason. The campaign AI was much more competent and aggressive, the AI factions no longer being nothing more than expansion targets. They were clearly playing to win just like the player. These are a few different campaigns where you can very quickly spot a few AI factions rivaling my own. Realm Divide doesn't feel like a crude take on a final boss. It feels more like the natural conclusion to the struggle encompassing the whole map. If you're so clearly about to eclipse the other factions, why wouldn't they, and why shouldn't they, both in real and gameplay terms, set aside their differences to fight what they know could be the very thing that destroys them? Even the developers themselves remarked on the matter. The thing is, the developers, even when they were putting together core elements of the game prior to its 2013 release, seem to have been at least tacitly aware of the potential for snowballing in Rome 2. It's part of my theory for why they revamped the province system. Whereas each and every settlement in the prior game was equally upgradable, Rome 2 introduces provinces that are composed of a province capital and a few minor settlements, the latter lacking walls and therefore being much more difficult to defend. When you combine this with the new recruitment system and army limits, your ability to maintain control over most settlements is significantly compromised. But you could, say, attempt to alleviate this issue by focusing your expansion on capitals, only to have your basic military sense chime in to tell you that multiple isolated settlements surrounded by potential or actual enemies do not lend themselves well to territorial defense either. Furthermore, the game incentivizes completing provinces through province-wide edicts that grant bonuses to the collection of settlements. Put this all together and your expansion routes are far more linear than they have ever been. Even Shogun 2, a game whose setting is confined to a map full of narrow corridors, your expansion options were far more fluid thanks to each and every province being a potential point to hunker down. In one game, you might choose to outfit your capital with improved fortifications and military buildings. In another, you might choose to treat it as a purely expendable buffer zone, or you could forego building up your own provinces in favor of having the AI foot the bill for upgrades and then seizing the fruits of their labors for yourself. Many of these considerations are thrown out the window when you have predetermined major and minor settlements. It takes a lot of effort to make a map that looks like this somehow feel more restrictive than one that looks like this, but they seem to have mustered all their studio's resources for that undertaking. It also leaves less for you to think about regarding your building options. It won't take long to work out that you should be prioritizing military buildings in the capitals, while the minor settlements house the economic and civic buildings that will confer passive bonuses. But perhaps the most negative effect is dealt to your ability to defend your late game empire. Get ready to have an AI faction that you far outclass in resources and military power, keep nabbing defenseless settlements, never actually posing a threat to you but being far more of a nuisance than they have any right to be. The restrictions are also pretty easy to game on top of all that. If you're ever running against the army cap, you could always just disband one of your existing armies and spawn another in a region where they're more needed. And by the late game, you'll already have so much in funds and your military infrastructure will be so heavily developed that you can spawn in 6 or 7 Eagle cohort units or equivalent quality units. So at the end of the day, all the restrictions really do is just pad out the campaign unnecessarily. Interfacing is one of those things that you don't tend to notice unless it's done poorly. A good interface is the one that has to perform the least amount of work, and the work that it is charged with should be handled in a manner that is unintrusive to the player. Visually, Total War traditionally managed this aspect quite well, going back to the very first Shogun game, where unit cards were distinct enough that you would rarely ever confuse units. Interactively though, the games have forced players to wrestle with slow cameras, and in the case of Rome 1 and Medieval 2, clunky mouse inputs. It wasn't until Empire that Total War finally managed a modern interface. Napoleon and Shogun 2 carried on this positive trend. But while Rome 2 keeps the responsive inputs, the game drops the ball visually, most visibly in the indistinguishable unit cards. Take a look at the plethora of melee infantry available to Rome, as an example. Furthermore, the unit status indicators have been shoved onto the unit cards themselves, rather than taking up a tiny spot above them. It makes it that much more difficult to rely on your peripheral vision to monitor the UI. Does this even matter that much? In an early game battle with a handful of units, not a whole lot. But in a 10 or 20 unit battle, and remember, thanks to the restrictions on armies, you will be consolidating your forces into larger stacks to make the most of the limited army slots. Having to scroll through cards waiting for indicators to cycle through their different icons only compromises your ability to manage your forces effectively in the heat of battle. Real-time strategy games are very time sensitive. Falling behind even slightly, or taking the time to correct even minor errors, can bear consequences harsh enough to determine the outcome of a fight. However, the inefficient visual interfacing is less of a problem and more of a symptom of a wider issue: roster bloat. If there wasn't an excessive number of units with only minor stat differences between them, there wouldn't be a need to design unit cards for all of them. And remember what I said earlier about a good interface having to do very little work? Rome 2 saddles a lot of work onto its interface. Because a lot of the visual cues and feedback for in-game actions have been neutered, Shogun 2 made an efficient use of color in its unit cards. Red represented samurai while Ashigaru were depicted in green outfits. Even individual samurai units had subtle but distinct differences between them. Katana samurai with a darker shade of red, Yari and bow samurai a dark shade of orange, while no dachi have a red on pink scheme. The poses serve to distinguish units further, Katana samurai charging forward with the sword held high, while no dachi carried their sword off to the side. This way, you could within an instant approximate the strength of an enemy force, without having to sift through stat sheets or the encyclopedia. Visual effects have not been spared either. Take cavalry charges, for instance. A clean charge by a unit of cavalry into the rear of an engaged melee infantry unit. Not a spear wielder, might not even knock anyone over. Sometimes it will knock a bunch of soldiers over, but there isn't any of the dramatic flying that we saw in Shogun 2. I know that wasn't very realistic, but it signified that your charge was effective, even at full camera height. And if we're talking realism, then explain this. Given how micro-intensive cavalry are, their value lying in their ability to deal decisive morale shocks to the enemy, it's necessary to be able to tell at a glance that a charge bore the intended effect, without having to select the unit and monitor its kill count. But why the inconsistency in the charge's impact? Health bars. Prior to Rome 2, Total War utilized a hit point system where every soldier in a unit had one hit point. When attacked, a soldier either took the hit and died or parried the blow. While glancing blows that did a fraction of a hit point of damage did exist, most attacks were lethal if they landed. This applied to both melee and missile attacks. Armor under this system didn't add any hit points, it simply worked together with melee defense to reduce the chances of being hit. There were a few exceptions to the 1 hit point per entity rule, such as war elephants having 3 hit points per model and more elite infantry having 2 hit points, obviously to prevent them from being one-shotted. If you run an infantry on infantry charge in Rome 2 and any prior game back to back, you will likely be struck by the difference. The charges in the older games were more decisive, with 10, 20 or even upwards of 30 men dying in one unit within seconds. Rome 2 ditches hit points for health bars, where most damage is non-lethal. This is why a fresh unit can take a few volleys without losing any men, only to lose several in the next one. Some people will argue that the new health bar system is just a different take on combat, and will achieve the same effect as its predecessor. After all, you are using charges and missile attacks to wear down a unit, right? That hasn't changed. While the difference between the two systems might seem academic on paper, I mean, a lot of the changes they made to this game sound fine on paper and in marketing pieces, that's a theme. In practice, the non-lethality of damage needlessly complicates combat, requiring you to stare at units' health bars to gauge how much of a fight they have left in them. Rather than simply looking at all the dead men, if I'm playing a game on the highest graphics settings with, say, 160-man infantry regiments, all I need to do to figure out how much of a fight is left in a unit is simply to look at it. At most, you hover your cursor over the enemy's unit and see their name with the number of remaining men displayed. 50 men left? I guess a good cavalry charge or missile volley will break them. Simple, intuitive, and you don't have to roleplay as an accountant keeping track of how many more arrows you need to put into a guy to kill him. I am aware that the older system wasn't always consistent in its results. There is a time when a wavering, depleted unit somehow manages to stabilize its morale after taking a charge that you were sure would knock it out of the fight. Again, I'm not trying to imply the older systems were perfect or that this video is being fueled by blind nostalgia. When you get down to how these games play, the unit-on-unit interactions, the relationship between actions and results, what we got in Rome 2 is just worse than what we had earlier, especially in regards to its immediate predecessor. Less intuitive, less visually impactful, and with little to no respect for a player trying to defeat superior forces through their resourcefulness. I have to go through the efforts of ensuring that none of these units are allowed the second chance in the fight. None of these enemy units are allowed the second chance. All right. I'm going to turn off guard mode so they actually run after the units. I did not use rally. Maybe I should have. So here it comes. Here it comes. Here it comes, boys. Here it comes. This is where we drop the hammer on them. And they're already wavering. They're already wavering. Hang on. They're already wavering. Oh boy. Holy crap. Whoa. General? Do I need to kill a general? Who said I needed to kill a general for this to work? Anyway, that's it. They're done. They're gone. Holy crap. Oh my god.
One of our units has used all its ammunition.
This chapter has not so much to do with Rome 2 itself, and more with the modding community surrounding it. Specifically, I'm talking about the sentiment that while the base game may have its flaws, these are addressed in a plethora of efforted mods. If you're a fan of these mods, and even if you're not, you may at this moment be led to believe that I will take a trip to some of the game's most acclaimed mods, such as Divide at Impera, or DEI for short. And I'll admit, I am tempted to descend into that whirlpool, but I must resist that temptation and will instead head this off at the pass. Even if a mod like DEI does hold the answers to the base game's problems, the base game is still garbage, which is what really matters over here. This idea, the insinuation that a game's flaws can be forgiven because a certain mod exists, is infuriating. Firstly, it takes the heat off the developers who made a mess of the game in the first place. Secondly, there is an ethical question to be had regarding the expectation, implicit or explicit, that unpaid modders will do the work of paid developers. Thirdly, it derails conversations away from the actual mechanics of the games, which confuses people coming from the outside of the scene who would like to know more about the game at hand and who might not care or wish to use mods. And fourthly, continuing on that point, why should we set the expectation that people need to do however many hours of research and testing mods to finally get a decent experience out of a game they paid their hard-earned cash for? If you're currently in high school and have plenty of free time, you might wonder what I'm getting at with my last question here. I think it's borderline insulting to grown-ups who are already saddled with a myriad of responsibilities, who may not have much time to spend on their hobbies, that you would unwittingly help to foster an environment where people can't just sit down and play a game. The whole reason I play games and don't develop them is that I would much rather pay someone else to do that for me. The same way you might pay someone else to work on your car than do it yourself. I am not interested in offloading that work onto myself, and that's precisely why I and many people in my audience abhor the current trend of needing to do mod homework for a game you already bought. I should clarify that I'm not at all against the idea of modding on principle. I use several cosmetic mods for Shogun 2 myself, and it's great that mods can allow you to tailor a good game, emphasis on good, more to your liking. And I'm a big fan of emulating a lot of console games and sinking hours on a Sunday afternoon into tinkering with community-made texture packs and frame rate cheats. But I'm also sensible enough to acknowledge that this kind of faffing about with the computer is not something that will appeal to everyone, and when it comes to mainstream gaming, I have a strong distaste for the expectation that mods should be fixing bad games. It applies to Rome 2 the same way it applies to the mods addressing Empire Total War's issues, as well as the Hattori and Tokugawa Kisho Ninja mod fix in Shogun 2. While we haven't covered everything in this game in excessive detail, such as politics, the naval battles themselves, and the downgraded multiplayer experience, I think we've done enough to get the overall point across. Rome 2 is not a thoughtful showcase of either grand strategy or tactics, and it's quite a shame that the game launched in a bug-riddled state, because that diverted people's attention from the significant and almost exclusively negative changes that were made to the core design. Rome 2's primary and all-encompassing issue is not that of bugs and poor optimization, but of deliberate design choices. And this is why it's misleading to lump the game in with Empire Total War as the bad Total War games. Empire was a decent game marred by glitches and particularly bad AI. Rome 2 is simply rotten to its very core. Napoleon and Fall of the Samurai give us a hint at how much better Empire could have been had the game been given a few more months to cook. Whereas Rome 2 has been the blueprint for every game since, and in every instance the series is let down by the asinine commitment and doubling down on that game's design philosophy. Therein lies the biggest tragedy of Rome 2, its legacy. Every problem I highlighted in this video applies just as much, if not more so, on all subsequent titles. We're still dealing with a restrictive army system. Only in Warhammer, you now have access to global recruitment, which simplifies army management even further. The Warhammer games removed many of the formations that were a series staple, though they did return in Three Kingdoms, designed along the same lines as the Rome 2 formations. Only this time their effects are even more obtusely presented, with an even stronger emphasis on passive bonuses that have no relation whatsoever to the shape, density, or direction of the unit.
But that's all okay. It's just a scratch. Just a scratch. Yeah, nothing is working. And then we can do this. Look at how this formation just breaks apart. Let's break the formation apart as much as possible. Just spam movement orders. Yep, none of these guys are dying. Look at this, guys. You know why? Because these aren't actual like modeled as projectiles. That's because it's just damage modifiers, you know, plus 100% range block chance. You know, the game says 100% range block chance. The game says 100% range block chance. Yeah, no wonder the Romans conquered much of the known world, you know, using testudo. It makes perfect sense now. I wondered how the Romans could create such a massive empire at that time. It's just, here it is. Total War 3 Kingdoms gave you the answer. I want to see what happens the moment they make contact. Does the formation break apart?
Your form needs improvement. Do you intend to bore me to death?
Okay, so no, according to the game, I still have the full range block chance and everything. Yeah, they're just slowly marching forward to the shields above their heads, and the AI is just giving way.
The visual and sound effects have become even softer. Some very important animations and sound effects, like muzzle flash and smoke effects, aren't even rendered at a far enough distance, in turn making the player ever more reliant on the user interface in a game that has an excessively high APM burden. Difficulty modifiers, meaning the stat buffs conferred onto the AI's units on higher difficulties, continue to be a blight on combat, fostering one-dimensional gameplay defined by excessive kiting, spell spamming, and a reliance on single entities. This particular point has been the subject of notable pushback over the years, the counter-argument ranging from a whataboutist, the older games have these buffs, to I don't really see what else they could do to make the game a challenge. I'll respond to that second one first. There are quite a few ways to manage difficulty smartly in a single player game. Take Zelda Breath of the Wild, a game that was notorious on launch and still is for how frequently players end up dying. If you played the game on Master Mode in particular, most enemies can one-shot you at the start of your journey. The game has very limited difficulty options at the menu screen. You have the choice between the standard quest, which is already quite challenging, and the Master Mode. But there's something else I'll term dynamic difficulty, which is the type of difficulty influenced directly or indirectly by your own in-game actions. Okay, bear with me a second. You've spotted an enemy camp in the distance, occupied by 3 or 4 bokoblins and maybe a moblin or 2. Almost all of their attacks will kill you in a single hit, assuming you haven't upgraded your health yet. There are a few ways to go about this, and I'll try to list them in order of toughest to easiest. You can simply charge in guns blazing, doing your best to avoid being cornered or hit by arrows, making sure to hit as many enemies as possible with your attacks, to make the most of your weapon's durability, and to leave yourself less vulnerable to being struck in turn. Or you can glide in from a higher point on the map, dropping a bomb to break the enemies up and disperse them before dropping in yourself. Or instead of dropping the bomb, you can bullet time arrows, nailing as many headshots as you can. Then there's the stealth option. You can sneak up to their cache and take the weapons, leaving some of them unarmed for the fight. And you can take the stealth approach further by sneak striking one of them, potentially killing them outright and leaving yourself with one fewer enemy to fight. If there are lookouts, and many camps do have them, you can take them out with a well-aimed arrow, preventing them from alerting their friends while eliminating the threat of getting one shot by an arrow during the melee. If you want to take out the whole camp using stealth, you can opt to wait till nighttime, during which you can sneak strike the sleeping enemies one by one. Or let's say you only care about the weapons and not harvesting monster guts. You can sneak in, or even run in, and take whatever you can before hightailing it out of there. Or the easiest option, you can simply ignore the camp altogether. The map is littered with them, and yet none of them is truly necessary to complete the game. This is dynamic difficulty, and difficulty done well. It's not about giving the player a sliding scale at the start of a game and then making every fight or task into a chore. It's about giving the player options in-game and the freedom to weigh the risk-reward of each. But I hear someone saying that this is a different genre, and surely it can't be applied in the same way to Total War. Except the game immediately preceding Rome 2 didn't offer the AI units any stat buffs. Shogun 2 had the usual money cheats on campaign, but in battle, units didn't receive any buffs to their morale or melee prowess. Though range units do get absurdly high accuracy and reload bonuses, which I also think was stupid and unnecessary. There was also an element of dynamic difficulty. The Western factions have access to some lucrative island holdings that are also quite isolated and easy to defend. Of course, you can ignore these entirely and just focus on Central Japan. More difficult, but in the direction of your actual campaign objectives. You could spend the time fortifying most of your settlements instead of relentlessly keeping on the offensive. It's pretty common for players to turtle right on the cusp of Realm Divide, but you may just as well charge head-on into it. But most damning of all Rome 2's legacy is the enduring dominance of unit quality over the results of a battle. Gone are the days where you could defeat superior forces through well-orchestrated morale shocks, leaving us with a meta of spamming single entities in a game series that is often lauded by its fanboys for having strong unit variety. Well, thank you for sticking around to this point, and special thanks to everyone on our awesome Discord server who provided me with some answers to whatever inquiries I had, allowing me to focus my critique and preventing the project from bloating into an overwhelming mess, and to those of you who provided me with some of the saves that I featured in this video. With the Warhammer trilogy over and the first post-Warhammer era game Pharaoh right on the horizon, the jury is still out on how much Rome 2's legacy has damaged the franchise. Attila was a commercial failure, and so has every non-Warhammer game been since then. The only exception being 3K's strong initial sales numbers, and even that game's post-release support was axed following subpar DLC sales. It has long been said at this point that Total War has only been kept alive by its attachment to the Warhammer IP, and it will be interesting to see how Pharaoh, the second non-Saga title to be released since Attila, ends up performing. I know a lot of you have written off the game already, and for very good reasons. CA is not backing off their extortionist DLC policies, not even with the recent Shadows of Change DLC price hike controversy, but you can be sure that I will be buying Pharaoh so that you don't have to. I have a morbid excitement in being the first to the scene of that accident, and I will be streaming that game on launch and probably doing a video or two on that. So you can hit that sub button if you haven't yet and are interested in seeing a takedown of that game, devoid of shilling of course, and in my honest opinion in every other sentence.